What happens when a name is stolen, when it is torn from the mouth of its mother and rewritten by the hand of power? You were never meant to hear this story, yet here you are, sitting in the dark with me. The silence you carry in your bones is not silence at all. It is inheritance, the weight of voices buried alive. Tonight, I will show you how obedience can be sharpened into a weapon, how silence itself can learn to kill. The tale is older than memory, rooted in blood-soaked soil, and carried forward by whispers that bend through generations like wind through cypress trees. Her name was Cora. On the ledgers of the Whitmore plantation, she was nothing more than ink. Female, 24, trained for house service, no defiance recorded. That was the lie. The truth was fire. But fire does not roar immediately. Sometimes it smolders, hidden beneath ash, waiting for the moment when breath alone can awaken it into fury. Cora's life had already been carved hollow by loss. Her husband Elijah had been whipped to death for the crime of stillness, for staring too long at the horizon as if he had the audacity to dream. They buried him in unmarked dirt, as though the earth itself were forbidden to remember him. Yet memory cannot be chained. When her son Samuel was born, Cora carried Elijah's eyes forward into the world. The boy did not cry. His silence was his protection. But silence, once broken, becomes prophecy. 2 days later, Clarissa Whitmore, wife of the colonel, stepped into the slave quarters without warning. Perfume trailing, gaze cold as polished steel, she looked upon the infant. She studied his skin, his eyes, the quiet that draped him like a veil. And then she said it. This one could pass. That casual sentence sealed his theft. By nightfall, Samuel was no longer Samuel. He had been stripped, renamed Thomas, wrapped not in rags but lace, placed into a crib carved for a child who was never hers. Cora was summoned, not to hold her son, but to scrub dog filth from the rug. Her hands obeyed, but her silence shifted. The other women whispered she had gone mad, staring into corners, fingers clenching invisible threads. Yet beneath her stillness, a vow had been stitched. She would wait, she would endure, and she would plan. Because a mother's grief does not die. It transforms. It curdles into something far more dangerous. And you, listening now, you are already too deep. This story is a wound. Once opened, it will not close. They said she had gone mute. That grief had turned her tongue to stone. The Whitmores did not care. A voiceless slave was easier to command. Orders barked, lashes threatened, and she obeyed with eyes lowered, lips sealed. But silence is not weakness. It is a chamber, a cathedral where thought echoes and sharpens. Cora's silence was no surrender. It was study. At night, when the quarters settled into uneasy sleep, she traced patterns in the dirt with her finger. Circles, spirals, symbols, half remembered from the mouths of elders long dead. The women mocked her, until the air around her hands began to feel colder, until the hair on their arms prickled when she drew. Cora listened to the quiet as if it spoke. She claimed it did. She said Elijah whispered from the soil, guiding her. Whether it was madness or memory, none dared interrupt. Meanwhile, young Samuel, now Thomas, was paraded in the Whitmore parlor as proof of Clarissa's divine favor. Guests sipped brandy and marveled at his pale skin, at his silence, at how easily he fit into lace and privilege. The child's eyes remained wide, fixed on nothing, as though some part of him knew the truth, that he was living a stolen name. Each time Cora saw him carried past, dressed in satin that her hands had stitched, she clenched her jaw until blood filled her mouth. Yet not a sound escaped. Her vow grew teeth. She would not scream. She would not beg. She would build her revenge from silence, brick by invisible brick. And she began to test it. When the overseer spat at her and struck her shoulder, she made no cry. When Clarissa commanded her to kiss the child she had birthed, now claimed by another, Cora pressed her lips to his forehead and inhaled deeply, but said nothing. That breath was hers, a theft in return, a reminder to him of where he had come from. Soon the quarters whispered that Cora had turned silence into a weapon. And they said her stillness unsettled even the dogs, that when she walked past, their growls broke into whimpers. They said the baby Thomas would not sleep unless she was nearby, as if some hidden tether bound mother to son, truth to lie. The Whitmores laughed it off. To them, she was broken. To the enslaved, she was dangerous. To herself, she was waiting. And waiting, in the dark, silence grows teeth sharp enough to bite through history. It began with whispers in the Whitmore house. Not from the enslaved, they knew better than to risk a murmur within earshot, but from the walls themselves, from the empty rooms where lamps guttered, though no wind stirred. Servants claimed they heard a baby crying in the nursery when Thomas slept soundly in his crib. Clarissa dismissed it as foolishness, yet even she started leaving candles burning through the night. Cora's silence was seeping into the wood, the plaster, the marrow of the house. She never raised her voice, never defied an order, but the more she swallowed her grief, the heavier the air around her grew. When she walked barefoot across the floorboards, they creaked low, almost mournful, as if echoing steps from another world. Guests noticed. They said the house felt colder when she entered the room, that brandy lost its warmth on the tongue. One evening, Colonel Whitmore himself confronted her. He accused her of unsettling the dogs, of unnerving his wife with her unnatural quiet. He struck her across the face, demanding she speak. Blood trickled from her lip, yet her eyes did not rise, her mouth did not open. He struck her again. Still nothing. Only the slow, deliberate drip of blood on the floorboards, each drop louder than a scream. The colonel left the room muttering, but the servants whispered he avoided her shadow ever after. Clarissa's triumph began to fray. Though she dressed Thomas in silk and paraded him as her own, the boy resisted her touch. He would not meet her eyes. He would not laugh. He would not call her mother. His silence mirrored Cora's, and it gnawed at her. Clarissa began to dream of the child as he truly was, not Thomas, but Samuel, birthed in blood and tears she had no claim to. She would wake screaming, demanding more lace, more perfume, more prayers to blot out the truth. But the truth clung like soot. In the quarters, the omen began to say Cora was cursed, or perhaps she carried a curse for others. They noticed how Clarissa's hair thinned, how the colonel drank deeper into the night, how the baby wasted in silence. Yet Cora remained still, washing linens, tending fires, bowing her head. She was building something invisible, something the Whitmores could neither name nor fight. And when the harvest moon rose that autumn, swollen and red, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, for silence was no longer passive, it was hungry. The first true break came on a night thick with harvest heat. The fields had been stripped bare, yet the air carried the stench of rot, as though the earth itself refused to surrender its dead. The Whitmore household retired early, lanterns dimmed, shutters closed. In the quarters, the enslaved huddled restless beneath thin blankets, waiting for sleep that would not come. And in the nursery, Thomas, Samuel, lay wide-eyed in his crib, refusing to close his stolen gaze. That night, Clarissa awoke to silence so heavy it felt like drowning. She sat up in her bed, pulse hammering, and realized she could not hear the cicadas, nor the wind, nor even her husband's snores. Only the faintest hum, low and steady, like breath beneath the floorboards. She followed it barefoot through the hall until she reached the nursery. The door creaked open. The child was standing upright in his crib, not crying, not moving, only staring at the corner where the shadows gathered thicker than they should. Clarissa stepped forward, whispering his stolen name. That was when she saw it, a shape in the dark, not solid, not smoke, but something in between. It did not move, yet the air bent around it, as if silence had been given body. She shrieked, snatched the boy from his crib, and fled to her chamber. Colonel Whitmore laughed at her tale, calling it hysteria, but the servants whispered that they too had begun to see shapes, shadows that lingered after the body had gone, reflections that blinked when no one moved. In the quarters, Cora said nothing, but her hands worked ceaselessly, weaving rushes into patterns that no one recognized. Circles crossed with lines, knots within knots. The women grew fearful, refusing to touch the strange bundles she left near the hearth. Some said they found bones within them, too small to be animal, too clean to be chance. Still, no one dared question her. Then came the fire. A single candle, left burning in the colonel's study, collapsed into flame. Papers, ledgers of names, prices, and debts curled into ash. Yet nothing else burned. The fire died before it touched the walls, leaving only smoke and ruin. When confronted, the overseer swore he had seen Cora standing in the doorway, her lips moving soundlessly, her eyes fixed on the ledgers as they blackened. But when they searched for her, she was already back in the quarters, head bowed, hands folded as though in prayer. From that night onward, the Whitmores stopped calling her broken. They started calling her dangerous. By winter, the Whitmore plantation no longer sounded like a place where life endured. The fields lay barren, the quarters whispered only in fragments, and inside the house, silence ruled like a tyrant. No music, no laughter, no prayers rang clear. Even the colonel's boots seemed to fall softer, as if afraid of being heard. The boy, Samuel, though forced to answer to Thomas, grew stranger with each passing week. His voice did not come, his laughter never arrived. He shadowed the world in perfect quiet, a mirror of his mother. Clarissa, once proud to parade him before neighbors, now locked him away, terrified by the way his dark eyes lingered on her with something older than infancy. More than once, she swore she woke in the night to find him standing at the foot of her bed, watching, always silent, always still. Colonel Whitmore's temper blackened. He struck harder, drank deeper, demanded louder. Yet none of it filled the void growing in his house. At times, he swore he heard whispers in the walls, not in English, but in broken fragments of a tongue he did not know. At other times, he would see Cora bent over her chores, lips unmoving, and still swear he heard her humming. The sound was not music. It was more like the low thrum of earth splitting underfoot. The overseer begged him to sell her off, to rid the estate of her shadow, but the colonel refused. To rid himself of Cora would mean ridding himself of the boy, and Clarissa would not allow it. She clutched the child tighter the more he resisted her, rocking him through endless nights of silence, whispering prayers that sounded more like bargains. Her face thinned, her eyes hollowed, yet still the child would not call her mother. Meanwhile, in the quarters, the enslaved began to treat Cora with reverence and dread. They left offerings near her mat, bread, scraps of cloth, even teeth lost from old age, as if appeasing something not entirely human. They said her silence had grown so deep it reached below the soil, that she could hear the groans of buried bones. They warned their children never to cross her shadow, lest it swallow them whole. And through it all, Cora remained still. Her silence was a blade, honed sharper each day. She no longer bowed to the colonel's rage, no longer flinched at Clarissa's glares. When they demanded answers, she gave none. When they demanded obedience, she offered only stillness. And in that stillness, the Whitmores began to unravel, thread by thread, as though her silence itself had become the loom upon which their ruin was being woven. The first death came without warning. The overseer, a man of iron fists and sour breath, was found hanging from the rafters of the barn. His tongue bulged, eyes wide, face blue. The rope that strangled him was braided from the very rushes Cora had been weaving in secret, yet no one had seen her enter the barn. No footprints marked the frost outside. Only the body swung in slow rhythm, creaking as though the silence itself had hoisted him into the air. The colonel raged. He accused the enslaved of mutiny, threatened the whip, threatened worse. But no one confessed. No one dared. For every soul on that plantation knew the truth they could not speak. The overseer had crossed Cora one too many times. And when Cora lifted her eyes at the colonel's fury, unblinking, Unmoving, he faltered mid-threat. For the first time in his life, he feared not rebellion of arms, but rebellion of silence. Clarissa's grip on reality frayed. She refused to enter the nursery alone, insisting that shadows bent toward her whenever she crossed the threshold. At night she swore she heard a lullaby, low, steady, the rhythm of a woman humming to her child. But it came not from her lips. It came from beneath the floor. She begged her husband to let the child sleep in their room, but even there, the silence followed. They woke drenched in sweat, hearing tiny footsteps pacing through the boy lay still. The enslaved whispered that the balance had shifted. Cora's silence had crossed into power, no longer endurance, but command. The air thickened around her. Flames burned lower when she passed, dogs whimpered instead of barking, and once, when a girl cried too loudly in the quarters, Cora placed a single finger to her lips. The crying stopped. Not quieted. Stopped. The child gasped, unable to make a sound until Cora lowered her hand. The mothers crossed themselves, some in fear, some in awe. The colonel tried to break her with violence. He dragged her into the yard at dawn, stripped her to the waist, and raised his whip. But when the leather fell, no sound followed. No crack, no cry, no sob. The air swallowed the lash whole. He struck again, harder, again and again, but the silence devoured every blow. By the end, he dropped the whip as if it had turned to lead in his hand. He staggered back, sweat pouring, eyes wide with something he would never admit. Terror. That night, the barn still creaked with the overseer's ghost, and the plantation knew the silence had begun to kill. After the overseer's death, the plantation seemed cursed. The crops withered early, though the soil was rich. The cattle sickened, their eyes rolling white before collapsing in the fields. The servants whispered that the land itself had turned against the Whitmores, refusing to feed a house that had stolen a child's name. Colonel Whitmore drank himself raw. He prowled the halls at night with pistol in hand, firing at shadows that dissolved before the smoke cleared. His once booming voice grew cracked, shrill, echoing strangely as though the walls mocked his every word. At times he swore he heard his own name whispered back to him, not in English, but in that same low, broken tongue no one dared repeat. His rage turned to paranoia. He locked his study, boarded windows, and accused even Clarissa of conspiring against him. Clarissa was already unraveling. She clung to the child with shaking hands, forcing food between his lips, dressing him in silks that no longer fit. But Samuel, Thomas, resisted every touch. He did not cry, did not laugh, did not speak. Sometimes he did not even blink. He only stared, and the longer he stared, the more Clarissa shrank from him, as if the truth of her theft were reflected in those dark, unblinking eyes. Her hair thinned, her skin grayed. She began to mutter prayers, half forgotten, clawing at her rosary beads until blood welled from her palms. Yet even God seemed to have turned his face away. In the quarters, Cora's silence deepened into ritual. The bundles of rushes appeared everywhere now, wedged behind beams, tucked beneath floorboards, hanging like talismans above doorways. The enslaved stopped mocking and began to obey, carrying offerings to her mat each night. Scraps of bread, feathers, coins, anything to keep her gaze from falling on them. They called her the hollow tongue, the one who had swallowed her voice and fed it to the dar. And still, she spoke not a word. Then the deaths multiplied. A maid was found drowned in a shallow basin, though there was no water spilled on the floor. Another man collapsed in the field, eyes wide, clutching his chest, though no wound marked him. The colonel called it plague. The enslaved called it judgment. But everyone knew it centered on the house, on the woman who moved like a shadow among shadows, on the boy who mirrored her silence. By the time spring came, the plantation was no longer alive but rotting, a husk gnawed hollow by something unseen. The Whitmores were prisoners in their own manner, clutching at lace and liquor, while Cora's silence spread like a stain that no prayer, no lash, no bullet could erase. And the hunger of silence was not finished. It was only beginning to feed. The final night came beneath a swollen moon, red as blood and low as judgment. The Whitmore house groaned as if every beam carried the weight of 100 unmarked graves. The enslaved had long since fled into the woods, carrying nothing but their breath, unwilling to remain in a place where silence walked like a living thing. Only the colonel, Clarissa, the boy, and Cora remained. 4 souls bound together in chains not of iron, but of fate. Colonel Whitmore sat drunk in his study, pistol loaded, convinced he could shoot the dark itself. His muttering grew into shouts, then into sobs. When the fire in the hearth dimmed, he fired into the shadows, the report ringing hollow. The smoke cleared, and he saw her. Cora standing in the doorway, her face unreadable, her lips sealed. He raised the pistol, but his hand shook so violently the weapon clattered to the floor. The silence pressed in, thick, suffocating. He clutched his chest, gasped once, and fell dead, his heart broken by a weight no lash could command. Upstairs, Clarissa clutched the child to her chest. She rocked him violently, whispering, "Thomas, Thomas, Thomas," as if repetition could make the lie real. But the boy did not answer. His lips parted at last, not with her name, not with any name, but with a soundless breath that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Clarissa screamed. She ran through the halls, searching for light, for God, for salvation, but every door she opened revealed only shadows that gathered thicker and thicker until they moved like water. By dawn, her body was found crumpled at the foot of the stairs, her rosary beads shattered like teeth across the floor. And Cora? No one saw her leave. Some say she walked into the nursery, lifted her son into her arms, and vanished into the silence she had forged. Others say she dissolved into shadow itself, becoming part of the curse that fed on the Whitmore land. The boy, too, was never seen again, though children in nearby towns whispered of a pale figure at the edge of fields, eyes dark as midnight, watching without sound. The plantation rotted to ruin, vines swallowing the walls, windows gaping like broken teeth. Travelers who passed claimed the air there was too heavy, that even the wind fell quiet. Some swore they heard the hum of a woman's lullaby, low and endless, weaving through the branches. And so the name stolen was reclaimed, not on paper, not in flesh, but in silence. Silence that kills, silence that remembers, silence that cannot be erased. And now you, who have heard this tale, you carry it too. When your house grows too still, when the dark corners seem to breathe, listen closely. For silence has teeth, and once it has tasted blood, it never goes hungry again.